Have you ever felt the breath of a predator on the back of your neck and realized you were running towards something far more dangerous? Seraphina Blackthorne thought escaping the suffocating borders of Blackwood Village was the hardest thing she'd ever do. She believed that leaving behind a forced contract and a lifetime of submission meant she was finally running toward freedom, but she was dead wrong. As the midnight snow crunched beneath her bleeding feet, she didn't know that the undisputed ruler of the Northern Territories, the Alpha King himself, wasn't hunting her. He was waiting for her, and terrifyingly enough, he already knew her name. But that revelation was still 3 brutal hours away. Right now, in this exact moment, Seraphina was doing something she never thought she'd have the courage to do. She was breaking into her father's study. The Blackthorne estate crouched at the edge of Blackwood Village like a decaying monument to old power. 3 stories of dark timber and stone windows, perpetually shuttered smoke, rising from chimneys that burned year-round in the relentless cold of the Pacific Northwest Mountains. Seraphina had lived in this house for all 22 years of her miserable existence, and she had never once felt safe within its walls. Tonight, the house felt especially hostile. Her father, Magnus Blackthorne, was at the village hall attending yet another late-night council meeting with Alpha Corvus. These meetings had become more frequent in recent months, more urgent, more secretive. Seraphina had noticed the tension radiating from the village leadership like heat from a forge. Something was wrong in Blackwood, something that made even the enforcers nervous. And Seraphina, invisible and dismissed as she had been for most of her life, had learned to notice things that others overlooked. Magnus locked everything. Trust was a currency he didn't deal in. She pulled a thin strip of metal from the pocket of her worn jacket, a piece salvaged from a broken lamp weeks ago. Her hands trembled as she worked the crude tool into the lock mechanism. Not from fear of getting caught. She was beyond fear now. Her hands shook because somewhere deep in her bones, beneath the chemical fog that had clouded her mind for as long as she could remember, she knew that whatever she found in this room would change everything. The lock gave way with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the silent hallway. Seraphina pushed the door open and stepped into her father's private domain. Cigar smoke hung in the air, mixing with the smell of aged leather and something else. Something metallic and bitter that made her already queasy stomach turn. A massive oak desk dominated the room, its surface cluttered with ledgers, maps, and correspondence. A dying fire cast flickering shadows across walls lined with bookshelves that held more decorative prop volumes than actual literature. Magnus Blackthorne was not a reading man. He was a surviving man, a calculating man, and apparently a selling man. Seraphina flipped through ledgers first. Revenue figures from the silver mine that Blackwood claimed as its primary industry. Shipment schedules, export manifests. Everything looked legitimate on the surface, but Seraphina wasn't looking at the surface anymore. She was looking for cracks, for lies, for the truth that explained why Alpha Corvus had started looking at her differently over the past 6 months, why her father had suddenly insisted she attend more village gatherings, why Bastion, her older brother, had stopped meeting her eyes entirely. She pulled open the desk drawers one by one. Office supplies, old correspondence, a half-empty bottle of bourbon. Nothing incriminating, nothing that justified the growing knot of dread in her stomach. Then she remembered something, a loose floorboard near the fireplace. She had discovered it as a child, had used it to hide small treasures from her brother's teasing. Magnus didn't know about it, or at least she had always assumed he didn't. Seraphina knelt by the hearth, her fingers finding the familiar gap in the woodwork. She pried up the board with shaking hands. The space beneath was not empty. A leather folder lay in the shallow cavity, its edges worn, its contents clearly accessed frequently. Seraphina pulled it free and opened it on the floor beside her. The first document made her breath catch in her throat. It was a contract. Official, notarized, bearing the seal of Blackwood Village at the top. Transfer of ownership and settlement agreement. Her eyes scanned the dense legal language, struggling to comprehend what she was reading. Terms like full custody, permanent relocation, breeding rights, and financial compensation swam before her vision. At the bottom of the document, in a section labeled Parties to Agreement, she saw 3 signatures: Alpha Corvus Blackthorne, Magnus Blackthorne, and in a hand she recognized with soul-crushing clarity, Bastion Blackthorne. Her father had sold her. Her own brother had signed the paperwork. The recipient of this transaction was listed as Sterling Security International. The compensation, $3.2 million. Seraphina's hands went numb. The folder slipped from her grip, spilling its contents across the floor. More documents scattered in the firelight. Medical records with her name at the top. Blood test results marked confidential, Aurelian markers detected. Correspondence between Magnus and someone named Arthur Sterling discussing acquisition of rare genetic material for bioweapons development. This wasn't just a forced mating contract. This wasn't even human trafficking in the traditional sense. They had sold her to be turned into a weapon. Seraphina's vision tunneled. The room spun. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that she should be crying, that she should be collapsing, that the betrayal of discovering your father and brother had commodified your body, your blood, your very DNA should break a person completely. But Seraphina Blackthorn had been broken for a very long time. What she felt now, rising through the chemical fog that had suppressed her wolf for 12 years, wasn't despair. It was rage, pure white-hot clarifying rage. She gathered the documents with mechanical precision, folding them into a tight bundle that she shoved inside her jacket. Evidence. She would need evidence for what she didn't yet know. But some instinct, older than conscious thought, told her that these papers were the only power she had in this moment. A sound from the hallway froze her in place. Footsteps. Heavy. Male. Coming closer. Her father was home. Seraphina shoved the floorboard back into place and moved toward the window. The study was on the second floor, but there was a trellis. She had climbed it as a child. She could climb it now. The window resisted, swollen in its frame from moisture and age. She pushed harder, muscles burning with effort. The footsteps reached the study door. The window gave way with a groan that sounded catastrophically loud. Seraphina didn't hesitate. She threw herself through the opening as the door behind her swung open. She heard her father's voice, sharp with surprise and anger. Seraphina. But she was already on the trellis, already climbing down with a speed born of pure survival instinct. Her hands slipped on the ice-slicked wood. She fell the last 6 feet, landing hard in the snow-covered garden bed below. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, but she forced herself to move. To run. Behind her, Magnus appeared at the window, his face a mask of cold fury in the moonlight. "Guards, stop her, release the hounds." The Blackthorn estate erupted into chaos. Seraphina ran toward the tree line, toward the forest that marked the edge of the village proper. Behind her, she heard the terrifying sound of heavy doors being thrown open, the snarling of engineered tracking dogs bred for one purpose, to tear flesh from bone, the shouts of enforcers mobilizing for a hunt. She had no plan, no supplies, no real chance of survival. But she ran anyway. The forest swallowed her in seconds, the dense canopy blocking out the moonlight and plunging her into near total darkness. Her eyes adjusted slowly, her suppressed wolf instincts struggling to surface through the wolfsbane that had been systematically fed to her for over a decade. She could barely see, could barely sense the terrain ahead. But she pushed forward, branches whipping at her face roots, threatening to trip her with every desperate step. The temperature was dropping. She could feel it in her lungs, each breath becoming harder, colder, more painful. Her thin jacket offered almost no protection against the sub-zero cold. Her boots, worn and poorly fitted, were already soaking through. She was going to die out here, but at least she would die free. The sound of the hounds grew closer. They had her scent. Of course they did. She was leaving a trail of disturbed snow, broken branches, and pure panic that even a regular dog could follow. These weren't regular dogs. These were Corvus's specially bred hunters, massive, vicious, relentless. Her legs burned with lactic acid buildup. Her lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. She couldn't feel her toes anymore. The edges of her vision were starting to blur, dark spots creeping in from the periphery. Hypothermia, exhaustion, the wolfsbane in her system preventing her body from accessing the enhanced healing and endurance that should have been her birthright. She stumbled, caught herself against a tree trunk, kept moving. A voice cut through the darkness behind her. Familiar. Heartbreaking. "Sarah, stop running. You can't make it to the border." Bastian, her brother, 28 years old, trained enforcer, and apparently willing participant in her sale to a bioweapons manufacturer. Seraphina didn't stop, didn't respond, just pushed herself harder, faster, deeper into the unforgiving wilderness. "Spread out." Bastian's voice commanded the other enforcers. She couldn't have crossed the ravine. The ice is too thin. But Seraphina wasn't heading for the ravine. She was heading for the Whitewater River. It was a desperate gamble. The river was wider, more exposed, infinitely more dangerous. But the moving water beneath the ice might mask her scent long enough to buy her precious minutes, maybe even a half-hour lead. It was a terrible plan. It would probably kill her. But it was the only plan she had. The forest opened up suddenly, and Seraphina found herself at the top of a steep embankment. Below, perhaps 30 feet down, a treacherous rocky slope stretched the Whitewater River. Even in the darkness, she could see the black ice reflecting the fractured moonlight breaking through the clouds. The river was wide here, at least 100 yards across, and beneath that frozen surface she knew the current ran fast and deadly. Behind her, the barking of the hounds reached a frenzied pitch. They were close. So close. Seraphina made her choice. She threw herself down the embankment. The descent was controlled for perhaps the first 10 feet. Then gravity took over. She slid, tumbled, rolled down the rocky slope, her jacket tearing on jagged stones, her skin scraping raw. She hit the frozen riverbank with bone-jarring force, the impact driving every molecule of air from her lungs in a white plume of condensation. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only lie there in the snow, staring up at the night sky, wondering if this was how it ended. Then she heard them, the enforcers at the top of the embankment, the hounds going wild with bloodlust. "She's down by the river. I smell blood." Seraphina forced herself to move. Every muscle screamed in protest, but she dragged herself to her feet and faced the river. The ice groaned beneath her first tentative step. A deep, ominous sound that spoke of structural weakness in watery graves. She didn't run onto the ice. Running would crack it immediately. Instead, she dropped to her hands and knees, distributing her weight as evenly as possible, and began to crawl. Slowly, carefully. The ice spider-webbed beneath her palms with every movement. Through the semi-transparent, frozen surface, she could see the dark water rushing violently beneath. If she fell through, the current would drag her under the ice sheet. She would drown in total darkness, her body swept downstream to be found days or weeks later, if at all. 10 yards from shore. 20 yards. The ice beneath her left knee gave way with a sharp crack. Freezing water bit into her skin like 1,000 needles. Seraphina bit down on her lips so hard she tasted copper, swallowing the scream that wanted to tear from her throat. She couldn't panic. Panic meant death. She pulled herself forward, rolling frantically toward thicker ice spreading her weight, moving with a desperate speed that made the already fragile surface groan in protest. Behind her, the ice she had just crossed caved in with a hollow splash. She made it to the opposite bank and collapsed into the snow, gasping, her clothes rapidly freezing to her skin. Above her on the ridge she had just left, 3 massive wolves burst from the tree line, enforcers in shifted form. They snarled at the broken ice, pacing the edge, unable to cross. A flashlight beam hit Seraphina, blinding her. "Don't move, Sarah." Bastion's human voice, cold, commanding, the voice of a stranger wearing her brother's face. "Corvus said he wants you alive, but he didn't say you needed all your limbs. Come back now, and I won't let the dogs cross at the Narrows." Seraphina shielded her eyes from the light, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at the man across the river, the boy who had taught her to track rabbits, the brother who had once protected her from bullies, now holding a rifle aimed squarely at her chest. "You sold me to a slaughterhouse, Bastion." Her voice cracked with grief and rage. "You signed the papers. You sold your own sister." There was a pause, a flicker of something in Bastion's shadowed face. "Regret, shame. I secured our family's future in this village." He called back, his voice tight. "Now be a good girl and cross back over before you freeze to death." Seraphina didn't answer. She turned her back on her brother, on the only family she had ever known, and dragged her freezing, battered body up the snowy incline of the opposite bank. Behind her, Bastion cursed violently. She heard boots running along the riverbank. They were heading for the Narrows, a point a quarter-mile downstream where the river narrowed enough for the ice to be thicker. Crossable. She had minutes. Maybe less. Seraphina disappeared into the dark woods of the neutral zone, leaving behind everything she had ever known. Her home, her family, her name for all practical purposes. All she had now was stolen documents, freezing clothes, and a rage that burned hotter than the hypothermia creeping through her veins. And somewhere ahead in the darkness, she was running toward the Alphaking was waiting. Though she didn't know that yet, the neutral zone was a different kind of hell. Where the Blackwood Forest had been dense and chaotic, filled with the violent energy of the hunt, this territory was profoundly unnaturally silent. Ancient trees twisted toward the sky like the arthritic fingers of buried giants, or trying to claw their way back to the surface. The canopy was so thick that even the moon, nearly full tonight, couldn't penetrate the darkness below. Seraphina stumbled through this primordial forest, running on nothing but adrenaline and the animal instinct to survive. Her vision had narrowed to a tight tunnel of gray and black. The edges of her awareness were fuzzy, disconnected. She recognized the symptoms from anatomy diagrams she'd glimpsed in Dr. Callie's office during a childhood illness. Hypothermia, stage 2 approaching stage 3. Her core temperature was dropping. Her body was shutting down non-essential systems to preserve the vital organs. Soon, paradoxically, she would start to feel warm, would want to lie down in the snow and rest, and if she did, she would never get back up. The wet fabric of her pants had frozen solid against her left leg, the leg that had broken through the ice. Each step felt like dragging a block of concrete through knee-deep snow. She had lost feeling in her feet entirely. Her hands were barely functional, clutching the hunting knife she had stolen from her father's study, in a grip so tight her knuckles had gone white beneath the blue-tinged skin. Behind her, perhaps a quarter-mile back now, she could hear them. The rhythmic thud of massive paws hitting the snow. The snapping of deadwood under enormous weight. They had crossed the Narrows. The enforcers were in shifted form now, moving with the terrifying speed that came from full wolf transformation. And Seraphina, poisoned and broken as she was running on fragile human strength alone. Her wolf had been silent for so long that Seraphina sometimes wondered if she had one at all. The wolfsbane in Blackwood's water supply had seen to that. For 12 years since she was 10 years old, she had drunk that bitter water every single day. Had felt the fog descend over her mind, had felt the instincts that should have been her birthright wither and die. The village leaders always said it was for safety, that the lower-ranking wolves needed to be kept docile to prevent challenges to Alpha Corvus's authority, that it was for the good of the community. Now Seraphina understood the truth. The wolfsbane wasn't about control, it was about concealment, about keeping her specifically weak and invisible, about suppressing the Aurelian bloodline that apparently ran through her veins like liquid gold. They had been preparing her for sale since she was a child. The thought sent a fresh surge of rage through her system, temporarily overriding the hypothermia. She pushed herself faster, her lungs burning with each breath of the sub-zero air. The forest began to thin. Through the ancient trunks, she could see moonlight painting the snow ahead. A clearing. That meant she was getting close to the boundary, the border between the neutral zone and the Silver Ridge territory. The Alphaking's land. Seraphina had never seen the Alphaking. Few people in the outer villages had. Theron Silvercrest was more myth than man, a legend whispered about in taverns and around fires. They said he had united the northern territories through sheer force of will and rivers of blood, that he was utterly ruthless with his enemies and fiercely protective of his people, that he had killed more than 200 wolves in single combat during the territorial wars 10 years ago. They also said he didn't tolerate trespassers. But Seraphina was out of options. Behind her was certain death or worse. Ahead was possible death. The mathematics of survival weren't complicated. She broke through the tree line into the clearing and immediately understood why this place had become a natural border. The ground here was completely exposed, a flat expanse of snow-covered meadow, perhaps 200 yards across. On the far side stood the boundary markers. Carved stone pillars, each easily 12 feet tall, covered in ancient runic symbols that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. Beyond those pillars, she could see a paved mountain highway cutting through the wilderness. The contrast was jarring. Primitive forest giving way to modern civilization in the space of 100 yards, 30 yards from the pillars. She could make it. She had to make it. 20 yards. A massive, terrifying roar erupted from the forest behind her. Seraphina risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. A silver wolf easily the size of a small horse launched itself from the tree line. Alpha Corvus's lead enforcer. She recognized him even in wolf form. His name was Cain, and he was known throughout Blackwood for his brutality. Two more wolves followed, their eyes glowing with predatory hunger in the moonlight. 10 yards from the boundary, Seraphina pushed her dying muscles to their absolute limit. Her legs were screaming. Her lungs felt like they were being torn apart from the inside. But she forced herself forward, step after agonizing step. She could see the asphalt of the highway now, could see the yellow line painted down its center. Safety, sanctuary, freedom. She wasn't going to make it. The silver wolf closed the distance in a single gravity-defying leap. Seraphina heard the rush of air as 300 pounds of muscle and fury sailed toward her exposed back. She spun, raising the small hunting knife, knowing it was utterly inadequate, but unable to do anything else. She braced for the impact, for the crushing weight of Cain's jaws tearing into her throat. For the end. The impact never came. Instead, a sound like a gunshot, but deeper, more resonant, echoed across the clearing. The silver wolf was violently intercepted in midair. Something moving with impossible speed slammed into Cain's massive form, redirecting his trajectory and throwing him 50 feet across the clearing. The enforcer crashed into an ancient oak tree with a sickening crunch of breaking bone. He whimpered once, a high-pitched sound of pure agony, then fell silent in the snow. Seraphina fell backward, landing hard on her tailbone, her knife still raised in trembling hands. The two remaining Blackwood wolves skidded to a halt, their hackles raised, low growls rumbling in their chests, but they didn't advance. They were staring past Seraphina, frozen in place, their aggressive postures collapsing into something that looked disturbingly like fear. The air in the clearing changed. The temperature seemed to plummet even further, but this wasn't weather. This was something else. An aura. A suffocating, crushing wave of dominance that rolled across the snow like a physical force. Seraphina's suppressed wolf, silent for so many years, suddenly whimpered in her mind, a sound of pure submission, of recognition. Her body wanted to bow, wanted to press herself flat against the ground and expose her throat. She fought the instinct, her human consciousness struggling to maintain control. Heavy footsteps crunched in the snow behind her. Measured, calm, deliberate. Seraphina forced her head up, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to cower. Standing between the boundary pillars bathed in pale moonlight was a man. He hadn't shifted. He didn't need to. He wore a sharply tailored midnight black overcoat over what looked like an expensive dark suit. The outfit was completely incongruous with the brutal wilderness surrounding them, yet somehow he commanded the landscape more thoroughly than any of the wolves ever could. He stood tall, perhaps 6'4", with broad shoulders and a build that spoke of both power and control. His features were sharp, aristocratic, carved from marble by a sculptor who understood that true beauty often came with edges that could cut. Dark hair styled with casual precision, strong jaw, high cheekbones. But it was his eyes that made Seraphina's heart stop. They were glowing, a brilliant molten amber that pierced through the darkness like searchlights. Ancient, powerful, utterly inhuman. Behind him, parked on the highway, was a sleek black SUV. Its engine purred softly in the frigid air. A driver stood by the open rear door, his eyes respectfully fixed on the ground, his posture radiating the same submissive fear that had gripped the Blackwood wolves. This was the Alpha King, Theron Silvercrest, and he was looking directly at Seraphina. The two remaining Blackwood enforcers whimpered immediately, dropping to their bellies in the snow, tails tucked firmly between their legs. The display of submission was absolute, humiliating. These were trained killers, bred and raised for violence, and they were cowering like puppies before a predator who hadn't even raised his voice. Theron didn't acknowledge them. His glowing amber eyes remained fixed on Seraphina, taking in her bruised face, her torn and freezing clothes, the pathetic hunting knife still gripped in her trembling hand. She stared back, unable to move, unable to speak. Every survival instinct she possessed was screaming contradictory messages. Run, submit, fight, freeze. Theron stepped past the boundary markers, officially entering the neutral zone. His movements were fluid, graceful, in a way that made Seraphina think of apex predators she had seen in nature documentaries. Lions, tigers, creatures that moved with the confidence of knowing nothing in their environment could threaten them. He stopped a few feet from where she sat in the snow. Up close, he was even more overwhelming. The aura of power radiating from him made it difficult to breathe, made it difficult to think. Seraphina's wolf was completely overwhelmed, pressing itself small in the back of her mind, simultaneously terrified and desperately yearning to submit to this male. Theron slowly reached into his overcoat. Seraphina flinched, expecting a weapon, a gun, a blade, something to end this quickly. Instead, he pulled out a crisp white linen handkerchief. The incongruity of the gesture made Seraphina's exhausted mind stutter. A handkerchief. The Alpha King, his most feared wolf in the Northern Territories, had just pulled out a handkerchief. He crouched down, the movement impossibly graceful, until he was at eye level with her. This close, Seraphina could smell him. Cedar and rain, clean and wild at the same time. The scent cut through the overwhelming stench of her own fear and blood and freezing sweat. Theron didn't ask if she was okay, didn't demand to know why she was trespassing, didn't threaten her. Instead, with a touch so gentle it contrasted violently with the lethal aura surrounding him, he reached out and wiped the trail of freezing blood from her cheek where a branch had cut her during the chase. His skin was warm, impossibly warm. The brief contact sent a shock of heat through Seraphina's frozen body. You took the long way across the river. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in Seraphina's chest, not threatening, almost conversational, but carrying an undertone of absolute authority that made it clear this man expected to be obeyed. I told my men you would arrive by midnight. Seraphina's jaw dropped. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind, already struggling with hypothermia and shock, tried to process his words and failed completely. He told his men she would arrive by midnight. What? The word came out as barely a whisper, her voice cracking from cold and exhaustion. Theron's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. He stood up, towering over her once more, and extended a gloved hand. The leather was fine expensive, like everything else about him. Did you really think your discovery of those ledger papers was an accident, Seraphina Blackthorn? He knew her name. He knew about the papers. He knew she would run. The implications crashed over Seraphina like an avalanche. The loose floorboard in her father's study. The folder left just obvious enough to be found. The timing of the council meeting that had left the house empty. I've been waiting for you to run for 6 months now. His voice carried across the silent clearing, each word landing with the weight of revelation. My operatives reported Magnus accessed the hidden folder 3 times this week. Tonight was inevitable. Get up. We have a syndicate to dismantle and you're freezing to death. Seraphina stared at the offered hand. At the man standing before her in his expensive suit and overcoat, but completely unaffected by the sub-zero temperature. At the glowing amber eyes that saw through her like she was made of glass. She had thought she was escaping, thought she was running toward freedom. But she had just walked out of one cage and directly into the carefully orchestrated plans of a predator far more dangerous than Alpha Corvus could ever dream of being. Behind them, one of the Blackwood wolves whimpered and began backing toward the tree line. Theron's eyes flicked toward the retreating enforcer for just a second. He didn't speak, didn't move, just looked. The wolf yelped and fled into the forest at a dead run, his companion following immediately after. Theron's attention returned to Seraphina. The offered hand remained steady. Patient, she had a choice to make. Refuse his help and die of hypothermia in this clearing. Or take his hand and step willingly into whatever game he had been playing for the past 6 months. It wasn't really a choice at all. Seraphina reached up and placed her frozen bloody hand in his. His grip was firm but careful, mindful of her injuries. He pulled her to her feet with effortless strength. For a moment they stood facing each other in the moonlit clearing. Predator and prey, king and pawn, or perhaps something more complicated than that. Can you walk? Theron asked, still holding her hand, his thumb brushing almost absently across her knuckles. Seraphina tested her weight on her frozen legs. They held but barely. I think so. Then walk with me. He didn't release her hand. Instead, he turned toward the boundary markers, toward the waiting SUV, and began walking at a pace that accommodated her limping gait, supporting her without making it obvious, allowing her the dignity of walking under her own power. Even though they both knew he could have simply carried her, they crossed the boundary together. The moment Seraphina stepped past the ancient stone pillars, she felt something shift, a subtle change in the air, in the very fabric of reality around her. She was no longer in the neutral zone. She was in the Alphaking's territory, under his protection, under his authority. And according to laws older than the modern borders, by seeking sanctuary here, she had just given Theron Silvercrest the legal justification to do whatever he wanted to Blackwood Village. The driver, a broad-shouldered man with military-cropped blonde hair, opened the rear door of the SUV as they approached. His eyes remained fixed on the ground, never rising to meet Seraphina's face. The level of submission was absolute. Weston, Theron said simply. Alpha 2, the driver acknowledged. The interior of the SUV was warm, blessedly overwhelmingly warm. It smelled of rich leather, expensive scotch, and that same cedar and rain scent that apparently belonged to Theron himself. The seats were pristine, and Seraphina hesitated, acutely aware of her filthy, bloody, soaking wet state. Get in, Theron said, reading her hesitation. The seats can be cleaned. You cannot be replaced. The casual statement made something twist in Seraphina's chest. She climbed into the vehicle, her frozen joints protesting every movement. Theron slid in across from her, the door closing and sealing them into this warm, quiet, absurdly civilized space. Outside the tinted windows, she could see the clearing where she had nearly died, could see the dark forest beyond, could see one of the Blackwood wolves' cane still lying motionless against the tree where Theron had thrown him. Drive, Weston, Theron commanded quietly. The SUV accelerated smoothly, leaving the nightmare of the Whispering Pines behind. Seraphina pressed herself against the door, as far from Theron as the confined space would allow. Her paranoid, exhausted brain was trying desperately to piece together what was happening. He had orchestrated her escape, had planned this for 6 months, had known she would run tonight. But why? What did the Alphaking want with her? You planted the ledgers. Her voice came out raw, tearing at her frostbitten throat. Theron reached into a compartment between the seats and retrieved a thick wool blanket. He tossed it over her trembling shoulders with the same casual grace he seemed to apply to everything. Not personally, no, My intelligence network has had operatives embedded in Blackwood Village for over a year. He spoke as if discussing something as mundane as the weather, as if admitting to a year-long covert operation was perfectly normal. When we realized your father Magnus was actively brokering a deal to sell you to the Sterling cartel to cover Corvus's debts, we expedited the timeline. Seraphina flinched at the name. Arthur Sterling. Even in the isolated villages, that name carried weight. He was a human, which made him all the more dangerous in wolf politics. A former military contractor who had built a private army and a smuggling empire that stretched across 3 continents. He collected anomalies, rare specimens, things that shouldn't exist. A pure-blooded werewolf with Aurelian DNA would be the crown jewel of his collection. Why do you care? Seraphina demanded, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her suppressed wolf was whining in her mind, confused by the overwhelming presence of the alpha sitting across from her, wanting to submit, wanting to trust. Seraphina crushed those instincts ruthlessly. You're the Alpha King. You don't involve yourself in border skirmishes. Why did you need me to run? Theron's glowing amber eyes locked onto hers. For a long moment he said nothing, just studied her with an intensity that made Seraphina feel like he was reading every secret she had ever kept. Because Seraphina, I am bound by the sovereign accords of 1892. His voice dropped into a register that was somehow both educational and threatening. Blackwood is a recognized autonomous territory. If I march my armies across that river to slaughter Corvus and shut down his smuggling operation, I violate the treaty. It would start a civil war with the southern and eastern factions who are just looking for an excuse to challenge my throne. He leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between them. The air grew thick. But the accords contain a loophole. Theron's voice became silken, dangerous. If a pure-blooded heir of a founding family seeks sovereign asylum in my territory, it formally nullifies the offending Alpha's territorial claim. By crossing that border tonight, you didn't just escape Corvus, Seraphina. You gave me the legal authorization to wipe him off the face of the earth. The words hung in the warm air of the SUV like a death sentence. Seraphina stared at him, the horrifying reality crashing over her in waves. She hadn't outsmarted anyone, hadn't won her freedom. She had simply walked out of one man's cage and directly into the center of a geopolitical chessboard orchestrated by a warlord. I'm a pawn, she whispered, the last of her adrenaline fading into hollow, crushing despair. Something unreadable flashed in Theron's eyes, something that looked dangerously close to fury. A pawn is sacrificed for the king, he said, his tone uncompromising, sharp. You, on the other hand, are going to be treated as royalty. You will never be sold, starved, or hunted again. That is my word. Before Seraphina could formulate a response, before she could even begin to process whether that was a promise or a threat, the edges of her vision finally darkened completely. The combination of hypothermia, exhaustion, blood loss, and the sheer mental toll of the last 3 hours dragged her under like a riptide. The knife slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the floor mats. She collapsed forward into darkness. Strong, warm arms caught her before she hit the floor. The last thing Seraphina heard before consciousness left her entirely was Theron's voice, quiet and commanding. Faster, Weston. Get us to the medical wing. Now. Seraphina woke to the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor and the smell of sterile cotton. Her eyes snapped open, panic seizing her chest in an iron grip. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling above her was white acoustic paneling, soundproofed and expensive-looking. Soft light filtered in from somewhere to her right. Everything was too clean, too quiet, too controlled. This wasn't Blackwood. This wasn't the forest. This wasn't death. Heart rate is elevating. Try to breathe through it, Seraphina. You're safe. Seraphina's head snapped to the left. A woman in a crisp white lab coat stood by a state-of-the-art IV station, her fingers dancing across a tablet screen. She had warm brown eyes, dark skin, and an easy, non-threatening smile that seemed designed to be calming. It didn't work. Seraphina's heart continued to hammer against her ribs. I'm Dr. Kelly, the woman said softly, setting the tablet down and raising her hands in a placating gesture. You're in the secure medical wing of the Silver Ridge estate. You've been unconscious for 2 days. 2 days. Seraphina tried to sit up, but her body refused to cooperate. Every muscle felt like it had been put through a meat grinder. Her head swam with dizziness. Easy. Dr. Kelly moved closer, one hand hovering near Seraphina's shoulder, but not quite touching. You were in stage 3 hypothermia when the Alpha brought you in. We had to use thermal blankets and controlled rewarming. Your core temperature was 86 degrees. Another hour and you would have died. Seraphina looked down at her hands. The frostbite that had turned her fingertips a terrifying shade of blue-black was completely gone. Her skin was pink and healthy. The cuts on her face and arms were bandaged, but she could feel the telltale itch of accelerated healing beneath the gauze. "How?" she croaked, her throat still scratchy and raw. Dr. Callie smiled. "Werewolf healing is a miraculous thing once you stop poisoning it." She picked up her tablet again, swiping through screens of data. "We ran a full toxicology screen when His Majesty brought you in. The levels of synthetic wolfsbane in your system were lethal, Seraphina. Not just suppressive, lethal. Another 6 months and the accumulated damage to your liver and kidneys would have been irreversible. Corvus wasn't just keeping you weak. He was slowly killing you." The words settled over Seraphina like a shroud. She had known the water tasted bitter, had known something was wrong. But to hear it stated so clinically, to understand that her own village had been systematically poisoning her to death for 12 years, made something crack in her chest. "The village water supply," Seraphina murmured, rubbing her temples. Memories were coming back in fragmented pieces. The chase, the river, the Alphaking waiting at the border. We all knew it tasted wrong. We just couldn't do anything about it. If we didn't drink, we died of thirst. Dr. Callie's expression turned serious, professional warmth giving way to genuine concern. "Well, you're officially in detox now. We have you on intravenous fluids to flush the remaining toxins. High-dose vitamin therapy, electrolyte balancing. But I have to warn you, Seraphina." The doctor pulled up a chair and sat down, bringing herself to eye level with her patient. "Your wolf has been trapped in a chemical coma for 12 years. As she wakes up, it's going to be violent. You'll experience fever aggression, phantom pains in your bones and muscles. Your first full shift will be completely uncontrollable. We've prepared a secure room for when that happens, but you need to be mentally ready. It's going to feel like dying." Seraphina nodded slowly, processing the information. She could already feel something stirring in the back of her mind, a presence that had been silent for so long, she had almost forgotten it existed. Her wolf, waking up, angry. The door to the private suite hissed open. Theron Silvercrest stepped into the room. In the harsh daylight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he was even more intimidating than he had been in the moonlit clearing. He wore a charcoal gray suit tailored to absolute perfection over his broad, athletic frame. The sheer authority he carried made Dr. Callie instantly lower her head and step back from the bed. "Leave us, Callie," Theron commanded quietly. It wasn't a request. "Yes, Alpha." The doctor bowed respectfully and exited the glass door, sealing shut behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss. Theron approached the bed, pulling up a sleek leather chair and sitting down. He scrutinized Seraphina with those unsettling amber eyes, his gaze tracing the fading bruises on her face, the bandages on her arms, the IV line running into her hand. "You look better," he stated. It wasn't a compliment, it was an assessment, a cataloging of damaged goods that were being repaired. "You look like a man who got exactly what he wanted." Seraphina shot back, surprised by the venom in her own voice. She had expected fear, expected the same crushing submission that had overwhelmed her in the clearing. But lying in this hospital bed in this glass cage of a room, all she felt was anger. Theron's expression didn't change. He rested his elbows on his knees, leaning closer. "What happens now is that my strike teams, led by my Beta Declan, are currently surrounding Blackwood Village. We officially invoked your asylum claim at dawn this morning. The Werewolf Council has backed my position. Blackwood is cut off. No one enters. No one leaves." Seraphina's stomach twisted. Despite everything, the betrayal, the cruelty, the sale of her life, a sickening knot of guilt formed in her gut. "My brother, Bastion, he's an enforcer for Corvus. He was the one tracking me through the forest." "I know who Bastion is," Theron said, his voice dropping 10 degrees. "I also know he signed the transfer papers alongside your father. He sold his sister to a cartel for a promotion and a cut of the profits. Do not waste your tears on traitors." "He's still my family," Seraphina said, her voice rising. The heart monitor beside her bed began to spike, beeping faster. A sudden sharp pain lanced through her skull. It felt like someone was driving an ice pick through her temple from the inside. Seraphina gasped, pressing her hands to her head. Theron stood up immediately. He didn't call for the doctor. Instead, he reached out, pressing 2 warm, firm fingers to the base of her neck, just below her skull. The touch sent a violent jolt of electricity straight down Seraphina's spine. Instantly, the blinding pain in her head subsided, replaced by a low purring sensation in her chest. A warmth that spread through her entire body like honey in warm water. The heart monitor's frantic beeping slowed to a steady, rhythmic pulse. Seraphina froze. Her eyes widened as she looked up at Theron. She knew what that spark was. Every werewolf knew the stories. The legends passed down through generations about the mating bond, the instantaneous biological recognition of two souls meant to be together. The spark that could ignite between compatible wolves, binding them on a level deeper than conscious choice. It was supposed to be rare, sacred, a gift from the moon goddess herself, and Seraphina had just felt it with a man who had manipulated her escape, who was using her as a political pawn, who represented everything she should fear and mistrust. Theron withdrew his hand quickly, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles ticked beneath his skin. He turned his back to her, staring out the massive window at the snowy peaks of Montana wilderness. "You're detoxing," he said, his voice gruff, lacking its usual unshakable control. "Your senses are misfiring. Your wolf is confused, that's all." But Seraphina wasn't stupid. She had seen the way his chest was heaving, had smelled the sudden spike of protective pheromones flooding the sterile room. He had felt it too, the pull, the recognition, the bond. "Why didn't you just let Corvus sell me?" Seraphina asked softly, staring at his broad back. "If Arthur Sterling bought me, Corvus would have his debts cleared. He'd still be running his smuggling operation. You could have found another loophole to take him down." Theron was silent for a long moment. His hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, slowly curled into fists. When he finally turned around, the cold, calculating king was gone. In his eyes was a terrifying, possessive fire that made Seraphina's breath catch in her throat. "Because Arthur Sterling is a dead man walking," Theron said, his voice a lethal whisper. "And because nobody touches what is mine." The declaration hung in the air between them. Not a statement of fact, a vow, a promise written in blood and backed by the kind of power that could level cities. Seraphina should have been terrified, should have protested being called his, should have demanded her freedom. Instead, her wolf, that long, silent presence in the back of her mind, lifted its head and purred. "Now rest." Theron continued, his tone shifting back to its usual commanding register. "The detox is going to get much worse before it gets better. Dr. Callie will monitor you closely. If you need anything, there's a call button by your bed." He moved toward the door, clearly intending to leave. "Wait," Seraphina called out. Theron paused, his hand on the door handle. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "For 2 days. Dr. Callie said I was unconscious for 2 days. Did you stay?" Theron didn't turn around. "I had work to do. The medical wing has secure conference rooms. It was efficient." It was a lie. Seraphina could hear it in the slight hesitation before he spoke, could smell the subtle shift in his scent. He had stayed because of the bond, because some primal part of him couldn't leave his mate when she was injured and vulnerable. But he wasn't ready to admit that, and frankly, neither was she. "Thank you," Seraphina said quietly, "for pulling me out of the river, even if it was just to use me as a political tool. Thank you for not letting me die." Theron's shoulders tensed. For a moment she thought he might respond, might turn around and say something that would make this entire situation make sense. Instead, he simply opened the door and left. The glass door sealed shut behind him, and Seraphina was alone. She looked around her luxurious prison. The medical suite was easily the size of her entire bedroom back in Blackwood. The bed was comfortable. The view was stunning. The medical equipment was state-of-the-art. She had access to food, water safety, and the best health care available in the Northern Territories. She was a prisoner wrapped in silk and called a guest. And the worst part was she didn't know if she wanted to escape. Dr. Callie's warning proved to be a gross understatement. For the next 3 days, Seraphina learned the true meaning of agony. As the synthetic wolfsbane finally leached out of her bone marrow, the entity that had been suppressed inside her soul for 12 years clawed its way to the surface with a vengeance. It felt like her blood was boiling, like her bones were being broken and reformed from the inside, like every nerve ending in her body was being lit on fire simultaneously. She thrashed in the bed, gripped by terrifying, hallucinatory fever dreams where she was back in the freezing forest, running from Bastion's hounds, falling through the ice again and again in an endless loop of drowning and resurrection. Through the haze of pain, she was vaguely aware of a constant grounding presence. Whenever the bone-breaking aches became too much, a warm hand would grip hers. A deep, rumbling voice would speak low, soothing words in a language she didn't consciously understand, but that her wolf recognized. Ancient Lycan, the first language. The tongue of the original Pax. The voice pulled her back from the brink of madness every single time. On the second night of fever, when Seraphina was convinced she was actually dying, when her temperature had spiked to 105 degrees, and the medical team was discussing emergency intervention, she felt that hand again, larger than hers, warm despite her burning skin. "Stay with me, Seraphina," the voice commanded. Not a request, an order from an alpha who expected to be obeyed even by death itself. "You don't have my permission, did I? Do you understand? You stay, you fight, you survive." And somehow impossibly she did. On the evening of the fourth day, the fever broke. Seraphina sat up in bed, gasping for air. Her hospital gown was soaked completely through with sweat. Her hair was plastered to her skull. But for the first time in as long as she could remember, her mind was crystal clear. The heavy, suffocating fog that had clouded her thoughts since childhood was entirely gone. In its place was an acute, razor-sharp awareness of everything around her. She could hear the hum of the electricity in the walls, could smell the pine needles on the trees 2 miles away, could feel the vibrations of footsteps in the hallway 3 floors below. And beneath her ribs, she felt the powerful, restless pacing of her wolf. Not whimpering, not cowering, strong, whole, free. "We are awake," a voice echoed in Seraphina's mind, not her own thoughts, a separate consciousness that was also intrinsically her. Wild, ancient, undeniably feminine. "We are strong, we are free, and we are angry." Seraphina swung her legs over the edge of the bed, expecting the weakness that had defined her entire life, expecting her muscles to tremble and fail. Instead, her legs felt like coiled steel. Dense, powerful, ready to run or fight or do whatever was necessary to survive. She stood up, her bare feet hitting the cold tile floor. She didn't stumble, didn't sway, just stood solid and strong for the first time in 12 years. The door to her suite opened. A man walked in holding a secure, encrypted tablet. He wasn't Theron. He was tall, lean, with sharp, fox-like features and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a dark gray suit and moved with lethal, calculated silence that reminded Seraphina of a predator trying not to be noticed. Her inner wolf instantly bristled. A low, aggressive growl ripped from Seraphina's throat before she could stop it. The sound was inhuman, feral, a warning. The man stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening in genuine surprise behind his glasses. He slowly raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Easy, Your Highness," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I'm Rowan, head of intelligence for the king. Theron asked me to check on you while he meets with the War Council." "I'm not Your Highness," Seraphina snapped, though she couldn't stop her hands from balling into fists. Her fingernails felt thick, almost painful. They were trying to extend into claws. Her gums ached. Her teeth wanted to sharpen. Her body was preparing to shift, and she had absolutely no idea how to stop it. Rowan offered a small, knowing smile. He lowered his hands, slowly projecting non-aggression with every movement. "Given that my alpha hasn't slept properly in 5 days because he refuses to leave the side of his newly discovered mate, I'd say you are exactly that, but we can argue semantics later. You shouldn't be out of bed. The first shift is imminent, and you need to be in the secure room when it happens." Mate. He had said mate, out loud, confirming what Seraphina had felt, what she had suspected, but hadn't fully accepted. "Where is Theron?" Seraphina demanded. Her blood was pounding in her ears. A strange metallic scent was wafting through the air vents, making her newly awakened senses scream warnings. Something was wrong. Her instincts, primal and newly unleashed, were going off like alarm bells. Rowan frowned, checking his tablet. "He's in the East Wing boardroom with Beta Declan and the strike team leaders. They're finalizing the assault coordinates for Blackwood Village. The raid happens tonight at 0300 hours. Seraphina sniffed the air again, her head tilting like a hunting dog catching a scent. The metallic smell was growing stronger. It smelled like copper, like blood, and beneath that something chemical. Burnt ozone, cordite, gunpowder. "Do you smell that?" Seraphina asked, stepping toward Rowan. Her bare feet made no sound on the tile. She was moving like her wolf now, even in human form. Predatory, silent. Rowan frowned, taking a deep breath through his nose. "Smell what the cleaning crew was here an hour ago. I don't smell anything unusual." "Blood," Seraphina interrupted, her eyes locking onto the ventilation grate above the door. "Fresh blood and cordite, gunfire. Something's wrong." As head of intelligence for the most powerful pack in the Northern Territories, Rowan didn't question the instincts of a pure-blooded wolf, especially one whose senses were hyper-aroused from detox. He dropped the tablet immediately and reached inside his suit jacket, pulling out a heavy, matte, black suppressed pistol with the smooth efficiency of a man who had drawn weapons 1,000 times before. He tapped a communications earpiece in his right ear. "Security Command, this is Rowan. Sit rep, on the perimeter. Talk to me." Static hissed in the quiet room. Rowan's face drained of color. "Command, respond," he barked, his calm demeanor cracking. Declan, if you're on this channel, we have a potential breach in the medical wing. I need backup now. More static, then silence. A massive explosion rocked the estate. The floor heaved beneath Seraphina's feet, throwing her violently against the wall. She hit hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. The reinforced glass windows cracked in spiderweb patterns but held. The lights flickered and died, plunging the suite into the ominous red glow of emergency backup lighting. Debris rained down from the ceiling panels. "Move!" Rowan shouted, grabbing Seraphina by the arm and pulling her away from the windows, just as a second explosion echoed from somewhere in the lower levels of the building. The sound of heavy automatic gunfire erupted down the hallway. Not the controlled bursts of trained enforcers. This was sustained, aggressive military-grade firepower. These weren't werewolf claws and fangs. This was a highly coordinated tactical paramilitary assault. "Corvus!" Seraphina yelled over the ringing in her ears, pressing herself against the wall near the door. Rowan checked the magazine of his pistol, his jaw set in a grim line. Corvus doesn't have the resources or the tactical expertise to breach the king's estate. This is professional. Military-grade equipment, stealth insertion. He looked at Seraphina, his eyes grim behind his glasses. This is Arthur Sterling. The cartel doesn't like it when someone steals their purchased property. Sterling had backup teams on standby for months. The moment his buyer lost the asset, Protocol Omega activated. The words sent ice through Seraphina's veins. Heavy boots pounded down the corridor outside the medical wing, not the graceful, silent footsteps of wolves. The heavy, synchronized marching of tactical operators in full combat gear. "Target is in the med bay," a gruff human voice barked through the door. "Secure the female alive. Kill anyone else. Those are Mr. Sterling's direct orders." Rowan positioned himself between Seraphina and the door, raising his weapon with steady hands. "Stay behind me," he ordered quietly. "Theron will tear this mountain apart to get to you. We just have to hold them off for 2 minutes. Can you do that?" "They have assault rifles, Rowan," Seraphina said, panic finally breaking through her shock. "You have one pistol." "Let me out," her wolf snarled, in her mind a furious, bloodthirsty entity that had been caged for a decade and was done being afraid. "They hunt us. We hunt them. Let me out." The door handle jiggled violently. Then a shaped explosive charge detonated against the lock. The thick oak door was blown inward, splintering into deadly shrapnel. Rowan fired twice. 2 rapid suppressed thips that dropped the first man stepping through the smoke-filled doorway. But 3 more operators flooded in immediately behind their fallen comrade, clad in heavy black Kevlar body armor, tactical helmets, and night vision goggles. They raised their short-barreled rifles, red laser sights, painting Rowan's chest like targeting markers. Rowan didn't have time to fire again. Seraphina didn't think, didn't plan. The sheer survival instinct of her bloodline bypassed her human consciousness entirely. A sound ripped from her throat. Not a scream, a terrifying guttural roar that made the tactical operators freeze in pure instinctual horror. The pain was instantaneous and blinding. It felt like every bone in her body shattered and reformed in a single second. Her spine elongated, her skull reshaped. Her muscles tore and rebuilt themselves into something far more powerful than human physiology could ever achieve. Her vision flashed white, then snapped back into focus, tinted in predatory hues of crimson and silver. Seraphina didn't fall to the floor. She exploded forward. Before the operators could pull their triggers, before they could even process what was happening, a massive midnight black wolf with blazing amber eyes crashed into their front line like a freight train made of fury and fang. Seraphina had shifted, and the beast was finally terrifyingly unchained. The transformation was not elegant. It was an explosive, violent biological anomaly. Seraphina's human consciousness fractured, instantly submerged beneath the overwhelming predatory drive of a pure-blooded apex predator, waking from a decade of chemical imprisonment. The heavy tactical gear of the Sterling cartel operators offered no protection against a force of nature. Seraphina's jaw, now a terrifying array of razor-sharp fangs, with a bite force capable of snapping steel cables, clamped down on the lead operator's assault rifle. With a vicious jerk of her massive muscular neck, she ripped the weapon from his hands, the reinforced polymer stock cracking like a dry branch. The man stumbled forward, off balance, his training failing him in the face of something his mind couldn't process. Before he could draw his sidearm, a paw the size of a dinner plate, tipped with 5-inch obsidian, claws swiped across his Kevlar-plated chest. The reinforced armor shredded like wet tissue paper. The man was thrown backward into the corridor. His chest cavity opened from shoulder to hip. He was dead before his body hit the ground. blood painting the sterile white walls and arterial sprays. Rowan dropped to a knee, shielding his face from the spray of drywall and gore. His eyes, usually cool and analytical, were wide, with absolute shock behind his wire-rimmed glasses. Female purebloods were notoriously swift and agile. They were built for speed, for stealth, for tactical precision. They were lethal, yes, but they were not designed for frontline combat. They were not built for raw, overwhelming physical power. The wolf standing over the ruined doorway was an impossibility. She stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, easily matching the size of the largest male alphas Rowan had ever seen. Her frame was heavily muscled, built like a grizzly bear rather than a wolf. Her coat was midnight black, so dark it seemed to absorb the emergency red lighting rather than reflect it. But it was her eyes that made Rowan's blood run cold. They weren't the standard gold or predatory green of most werewolf bloodlines. They were blazing molten amber, the exact same terrifying dominant hue as the Alpha King himself. "Moon Goddess," Rowan whispered, his grip on his pistol slackening. "Aurelian." The two remaining operators in the doorway recovered their wits, their training overriding their terror. They raised their short-barreled rifles, the laser sights dancing frantically over Seraphina's dark fur, searching for vital points. "Open fire! Put the beast down!" The deafening roar of automatic gunfire filled the cramped space. Hot brass casings rained onto the tile floor in a metallic symphony, but Seraphina was already moving. Her newly awakened reflexes were terrifyingly fast. She ducked beneath the barrage of silver nitrate bullets, the supersonic rounds tearing chunks out of the acoustic ceiling panels above her. She lunged low, driving her massive shoulder into the knees of the second operator with the force of a battering ram. His legs shattered with a sickening crunch that echoed even over the gunfire. The man screamed, a sound of pure agony that was abruptly cut short as Seraphina's jaws closed around his tactical vest. She lifted his 200-pound body like it weighed nothing and hurled him down the hallway. He crashed through a window at the far end of the corridor, his screams fading as he fell 3 stories to the courtyard below. The final operator backpedaled frantically, his rifle clicking empty. Panic consumed him, overriding his training completely. He reached for his tactical belt, pulling a heavy silver-plated combat knife. The blade gleamed in the red emergency lighting etched with symbols designed to be lethal to supernatural creatures. Seraphina stalked slowly out of the destroyed medical suite, stepping over the rubble in the spreading pool of blood. Her massive head lowered, her lips curling back in a snarl that vibrated the very floorboards. She was no longer Seraphina Blackthorn, the frightened Omega who had been poisoned and sold. She was something ancient, something that had walked the earth before humans built their first cities. A predator from the time when wolves were gods. The operator raised the silver knife, preparing for a desperate last stand. "Stand down, Seraphina." The voice boomed down the smoke-filled corridor, carrying a shockwave of absolute crushing authority. It wasn't a request. It was a biological command infused with the undeniable power of an Alpha King. Seraphina's wolf froze mid-step, her muscles locked up, the aggressive frenzy instantly halting. She snapped her massive head to the left, her glowing amber eyes fixing on the source of the command. Emerging from the stairwell at the far end of the corridor was Theron Silvercrest. His charcoal suit was ruined, splattered with blood that clearly wasn't his own. His tie was gone. His jacket hung open. But he moved with the same lethal grace, the same unshakable authority that seemed to be part of his DNA. Beside him stood his beta Declan, a towering wall of muscle standing easily 6'6", holding a terrifyingly large broadsword that was currently dripping with fresh blood. The man's face was splattered with gore, his expression carved from stone. Theron's glowing amber eyes locked onto the massive black wolf standing amidst the carnage of the medical wing. For a fraction of a second, the king of the Northern Territories looked genuinely stunned. He took in her sheer size, the midnight coat, those burning mirror image eyes that matched his own. The remaining cartel operator saw his chance. With Seraphina momentarily distracted by the Alpha's command, the mercenary lunged forward, driving his silver-plated combat knife toward the vulnerable expanse of her ribs. Seraphina didn't even flinch. Before the blade could pierce her thick coat, a blur of motion intercepted the attack. Theron had crossed the 50-foot hallway in a fraction of a heartbeat, moving with speed that shouldn't have been possible for something in human form. He caught the mercenary's wrist in his bare hand. The unmistakable sound of snapping bone echoed through the corridor. The operator shrieked, dropping the knife. But Theron wasn't finished. With cold, ruthless efficiency, he grabbed the man by the throat, lifting him 2 feet off the ground with a single hand. The mercenary's scream choked off his face, turning purple as his windpipe compressed. "Declan," Theron said, his voice a low, lethal hum. His eyes never left Seraphina's wolf. "Secure the perimeter. No one leaves this mountain alive." "Yes, Alpha." Declan rumbled, his voice like grinding gravel. He stepped past the carnage, his broadsword dragging ominously against the floor as he disappeared down the adjacent hallway. Theron casually tossed the gasping, suffocating mercenary against the wall. The man hit hard and crumpled to the floor, unconscious but breathing. Barely. Then Theron turned his full attention to the massive black wolf. Seraphina's inner beast was conflicted. The adrenaline of the kill was still singing in her veins, urging her to establish dominance over her territory, to lash out, to prove she was not prey. She let out a low warning growl, her hackles raising along her spine. Theron didn't shift, didn't bare his teeth, didn't respond to the challenge with aggression. He simply walked toward her, his movements slow, deliberate, and entirely unafraid. He unbuttoned his ruined suit jacket, shrugging it off and tossing it aside. Beneath it, his white dress shirt was torn and bloodstained, revealing glimpses of the muscular frame underneath. "You did perfectly, little wolf," Theron murmured, his voice losing the harsh edge of command and melting into something incredibly deep and resonant, something almost gentle. "You protected yourself. You survived. But the hunt is over." He stopped a foot away from her bloody muzzle, completely unconcerned that she could tear his throat out before he could even blink. The smell of his scent washed over her. Cedar and rain, clean and wild. It cut through the overwhelming stench of copper and gunpowder like a knife through fog. It was an intoxicating, grounding anchor that made something in Seraphina's wolf settle. Recognize, submit, mate. Seraphina's wolf whined, the aggressive posture dissolving like snow in sunlight. Slowly fighting the sheer exhaustion of the chemical purge and the violent shift, she bowed her massive head. She pressed her damp nose against the center of Theron's chest in a profound display of submission and trust. Theron's hands came up, burying themselves in the thick, dark fur at the nape of her neck. His fingers worked through the coat, finding the warm skin beneath. He exhaled a long, shaky breath that betrayed how afraid he had actually been. Not for himself, for her. He leaned his forehead against hers, the gesture intimate in a way that transcended species. "Shift back, Seraphina," he commanded softly. "Come back to me." The shift back to human form was agonizing in an entirely different way than the first transformation. The explosive power vanished, leaving behind a frail, exhausted human body that felt like it had been run over by a freight train and then set on fire. Seraphina collapsed onto the cold tile floor, gasping for air, her skin burning and flushed. Her muscles spasmed, her bones ached, every nerve ending screamed. She was also completely, utterly naked. Before she could register her vulnerability, before shame or fear could set in, Theron was there. He wrapped his heavy, dark overcoat around her shivering shoulders, pulling it closed and lifting her effortlessly into his arms. He carried her like she weighed nothing, ignoring the blood and ruin around them, stepping over bodies and debris with the same calm efficiency he seemed to apply to everything. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair. "I've got you." Seraphina wanted to protest, wanted to maintain some shred of dignity and independence, but her body had other ideas. She sagged against his chest, her arms wrapping weakly around his neck, her face pressing into the hollow of his throat where his scent was strongest. "Safe," her wolf purred. "Mate, safe." Theron carried her back into the partially destroyed medical suite, stepping carefully over the rubble. He placed her gently onto the one remaining hospital bed that hadn't been destroyed in the explosion. Dr. Callie emerged from the reinforced pharmaceutical vault where she had locked herself during the attack. Her hands were shaking, her dark skin ashen with fear, but she immediately grabbed a trauma kit and a thermal blanket. "I'm fine," Seraphina rasped, clutching the lapels of Theron's coat tightly around her neck. "I'm not hurt. It's not my blood." But even as she said it, the reality of what had just happened crashed over her. She had killed a man, had torn him apart with claws and fangs, had felt his bones break beneath her strength, had tasted blood. And the worst part was she didn't feel guilty. She felt powerful. Theron stood beside the bed, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked in his cheek. He looked at Rowan, who had holstered his weapon and was currently checking the vitals of the unconscious mercenary in the hallway. "Status, Rowan," Theron barked. Rowan adjusted his glasses, stepping back into the room. His usual composure was rattled, but he fell back on professionalism like armor. The strike team was small, highly specialized, 12 men total. Declan's forces just neutralized the remaining stragglers in the courtyard. They came in on stealth helicopters, utilizing radar jamming technology usually reserved for federal Black Ops operations. "How did they bypass the kinetic shielding?" Theron demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The Silver Ridge estate was protected by ancient runes intertwined with modern, military-grade kinetic dampeners. Nothing flew over this mountain, nothing landed on these grounds without the king's explicit permission. The system was supposed to be impenetrable. Rowan swallowed hard, glancing at Seraphina, before looking back at his alpha. The dampeners weren't bypassed, sire. They were manually deactivated from the inside. We have a mole in the central command center. A suffocating silence fell over the room. Betrayal within the king's inner circle was unheard of. The loyalty of the Silver Ridge Wolves was legendary, bound by blood oaths and fierce devotion built over generations. Arthur Sterling doesn't have the leverage to turn one of my command officers, Theron stated flatly, his voice laced with ice. Who authorized this assault? Who paid for it? I did. The voice was weak, coughing up blood, but it carried an undeniable arrogance. Theron turned. Two of Declan's enforcers dragged a battered, bleeding man into the room. It was the mercenary leader Theron had choked unconscious in the hallway. The man was human, wearing heavily modified tactical gear, bearing the insignia of Sterling Private Security. His face was a bruised mess, but his eyes were sharp and cruel. Let me guess, Theron said, stepping slowly toward the man with the deliberate pace of a predator approaching wounded prey. You're Grayson, Sterling's right-hand problem solver. I heard you had a penchant for taking suicide missions. Grayson spat a wad of bloody saliva onto the pristine hospital floor, grinning through broken teeth. It wasn't a suicide mission until that thing shifted. Our intel said we were extracting a standard pureblood female. Suppressed, weak. Corvus Quinn neglected to mention he was harboring a genetic fucking anomaly. Seraphina stiffened on the bed. What are you talking about? Grayson's bloodshot eyes fixed on her, his grin widening into something horrible. Did you really think Arthur Sterling was going to pay off a $3 million smuggling debt just for a pretty breeding wolf? Sterling doesn't deal in flesh, sweetheart. He deals in weapons. Theron's hand shot out, grabbing Grayson by the tactical vest and slamming him brutally against the wall. The impact rattled the remaining glass in the windows. Speak plainly, human, before I rip your tongue out, Theron growled. Grayson coughed, wheezing through cracked ribs. Corvus didn't just sell her king. He sold her medical files, her blood work. Sterling runs a private lab out in the Cascades off Interstate 90. He's been trying to synthesize a super soldier serum using werewolf DNA for 5 years, but standard wolf blood degrades too fast. It burns up in the stabilization process. He looked past Theron, his eyes fixing on Seraphina with something that looked disturbingly like scientific fascination. But her blood, it's different. Sterling's scientists found markers in her DNA that haven't been seen in 2 centuries. The Aurelian strain, the blood of the first alphas, the original pack. Grayson coughed again, blood flecking his lips. That's why Corvus suppressed her wolf for so long. If she had shifted naturally at 18, the sheer power of her aura would have alerted every council member on the continent. They would have taken her, protected her, made her untouchable. He laughed, a wet, horrible sound. So Corvus kept her weak, kept her hidden, waiting for the highest bidder. Sterling offered him $4.2 million for an Aurelian female. For the DNA that could turn regular humans into werewolf-level soldiers. Do you have any idea what that's worth on the black market? What governments would pay for that kind of bioweapon? Seraphina's mind reeled. The room began to spin. The Aurelian strain, the stories of the first alphas were fairy tales told to pups. Legends about wolves the size of bears. Wolves whose coats were as black as the void. Who possessed the power to command entire armies with a single roar? Who could break the minds of lesser wolves with their presence alone? They were myths, stories to make children behave. Except they weren't. Corvus knew what I was, Seraphina whispered, the betrayal carving a new hollow cavity in her chest. My father, Magnus, he knew. Theron answered before the mercenary could, his voice vibrating with barely contained lethal fury. He dropped Grayson to the floor in disgust. They poisoned you to hide your scent from the council. They kept you weak so they could control the ultimate weapon while they shopped you to the highest bidder. You were never a daughter to Magnus, Seraphina. You were an investment, a product, inventory waiting to be liquidated. He turned to Rowan, his expression carved from ice. Take him to the holding cells beneath the armory. Extract every piece of information he has about Sterling's operation. Names, locations, financial backers, everything. Then kill him. Yes, Alpha. Rowan nodded, signaling the enforcers to drag the laughing mercenary out of the destroyed suite. Grayson's voice echoed down the hallway as they hauled him away. You can't stop this? King Sterling has samples already. The DNA is out there. You're too late. Theron walked back to Seraphina's bedside. The anger radiating from him was palpable, a physical heat in the cold room. But as he looked down at her, his expression softened fractionally. He reached out, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her sweat-dampened forehead. "You are not a weapon, Seraphina," he said softly, the vow ringing with absolute certainty. "And you are no longer a pawn. You are an Aurelian, the last of the first bloodline. And as of tonight, Corvus Quinn and Arthur Sterling have just declared war on the crown." Seraphina looked up into his glowing amber eyes, recognizing them now for what they were. The same genetic marker. The same ancient bloodline. Theron was Aurelian too. That's why the bond had formed so quickly, so powerfully. They weren't just compatible wolves. They were the last two carriers of the first DNA, the original pack recognizing itself after 2 centuries of dilution and near extinction. The fear that had dictated Seraphina's entire life was gone, burned away in the fire of her first shift, in the clarity of her awakened power. In its place was the burning ancient instinct of a beast that had finally remembered what it was born to be. "Then let's go to war," Seraphina whispered, her voice carrying the dual resonance of human and wolf. Theron's lips curved into a predatory smile. "Yes," he said simply, "let's." The war room deep within the subterranean levels of the Silver Ridge estate smelled of rich espresso and impending violence. Holographic maps of the Cascade Mountains cast an eerie blue glow over the obsidian war table. Seraphina stood beside Theron, wearing custom-fitted midnight black tactical gear that felt strangely light against her newly awakened lethal physique. Beta Declan spread tactical maps across the table. "Sterling's lab is here. Decommissioned hydroelectric dam, Interstate 9040 miles east. 2 access points. Main entrance and a service tunnel on the north side." Theron studied the maps, his jaw tight. Rowan's extraction of Grayson confirmed 4 council members on Sterling's payroll. Counselor Alistair Belmont is the mole who disabled our shielding. He's at the lab now, with Corvus supervising the evacuation. Seraphina leaned forward, studying the schematics. Her newly sharpened mind processed tactical information with startling clarity. If you only hit the main entrance, they'll destroy evidence and escape through the service tunnel. Theron's amber eyes flicked to her, surprised. "You need a diversion team at the main gate." Seraphina continued, her finger tracing the map. "Draw their security there. Meanwhile, a second team breaches the service tunnel. Catch them between 2 forces. They won't have time to destroy the DNA samples or the financial records." Declan raised an eyebrow, looking at Theron. "She's right. Classic pincer movement." Theron's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile but held unmistakable pride. "Good tactical thinking, Seraphina." The words sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Not submission, recognition, respect between equals. "I'm going with you," Seraphina said, meeting Theron's gaze directly. "Absolutely not." Theron replied, his tone brooking no argument. "You shifted for the first time 5 hours ago. You can barely control the transformation. This is a military operation against trained mercenaries." "Corvus sold me," Seraphina shot back, her voice hardening. "Sterling wanted my blood. This is my war too." Theron studied her for a long moment. The war room fell silent, Declan and Rowan exchanging glances. No one challenged the Alphaking. Ever. Finally, Theron spoke. "If you come, you follow my orders. No exceptions, no heroics." "Partners." Seraphina extended her hand. Theron looked at her offered hand, then back at her face. After a heartbeat, he gripped her hand firmly. "Partners." The words settled between them like a vow. Rowan's tablet chimed. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting. "Sire, we have an encrypted message. It's from Bastion Blackthorn." Seraphina's heart stopped. Rowan read aloud, "Sarah, I know you'll never forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I can't let this continue. I'm sending coordinates to a hidden server with evidence, financial records, video surveillance, communications between Corvus Belmont and 3 other council members. Everything you need to destroy them. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to protect you. Let me at least help you end this. Your brother Bastion." Attached to the message were detailed files, bank transfers totaling $47 million, encrypted communications, video footage of Counselor Belmont manually deactivating the kinetic shielding systems. "It's authentic," Rowan confirmed, running verification protocols. "The metadata checks out. This is genuine intelligence from inside Blackwood." Seraphina's hands trembled. Bastion, her brother who had hunted her through the forest, who had signed her sale papers, who had chosen survival over family, was now risking everything to give her the evidence she needed. Theron watched her carefully. "Your brother is trying to make amends. The question is whether we can trust him." He shot wide, Seraphina whispered, remembering the forest. When he aimed at me across the river, he could have hit me. He chose not to. She looked up at Theron. We use the intelligence. And if Bastion survives this, I'll decide what to do with him then. Theron nodded. Agreed. 40 minutes later, 2 stealth helicopters sliced through the night sky over the Cascades. Seraphina sat in the jump seat, her heart pounding. Theron sat across from her, loading silver core rounds into a tactical shotgun with methodical precision. When we land, Theron said quietly, stay close to Declan. He'll keep you alive if things go wrong. I can fight, Seraphina replied. I know you can, Theron said, his amber eyes meeting hers. That's not what I'm worried about. I'm worried about losing control when I see Corvus. When I see your father, when I see the men who sold you like livestock. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. I need you to be my anchor, Seraphina, not my weakness. Can you do that? The trust implicit in those words stole her breath. Yes. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. 60 seconds out, 2 Blackhawks on the helipad spooling up. They're trying to evacuate. Take out their rotors, Theron ordered. No one leaves. Tracer rounds lit up the night sky. The helicopters on the dam's helipad exploded in brilliant orange fireballs, their escape routes severed. The stealth helicopter touched down. Seraphina leaped out her boots, hitting concrete. Theron landed beside her, moving like death incarnate. The massive steel doors of the dam's main entrance stood before them. Security klaxons wailed. Seraphina dropped to her hands and knees. Bones cracked. Muscles reformed. In 3 seconds, the midnight black wolf stood where the woman had been. With a roar that shook the mountain, Seraphina charged the reinforced doors at full speed. She hit the steel at 60 miles per hour. The kinetic force of an Aurelian wolf in full assault was catastrophic. The doors didn't just buckle. They were torn clean off their hydraulic mountings and sent flying into the facility's sterile white lobby. Seraphina shifted back to human form, Theron's coat already there to cover her as he'd thrown it the moment before impact. Standing at the far end of the corridor were 4 men. Alpha Corvus Blackthorn, holding a silver briefcase. Magnus Blackthorn, her father, his face pale with terror. Bastion Blackthorn, unarmed, his eyes meeting hers with profound regret. And Counselor Alistair Belmont, reaching for a weapon. Kill her, Corvus screamed. Seraphina didn't give them the chance. She unleashed the full weight of her Aurelian aura. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The air itself seemed to thicken, to press down with the weight of ancient authority. Corvus dropped to his knees, his alpha dominance shattered like glass against stone. Magnus collapsed forward, his forehead hitting the floor in involuntary submission. Even Belmont, a council member with decades of power, fell to his hands and knees, whimpering. Only Bastion remained standing, though barely. He met Seraphina's blazing amber eyes. I'm sorry, he whispered. Sarah, I'm so sorry. Theron stepped past Seraphina, his own aura adding to the crushing pressure. He looked at each man in turn with cold judgment. You are all under arrest by the authority of the Northern Alliance, Theron declared. The charges are human trafficking, conspiracy, attempted murder, and high treason. 3 days later, the Alliance Grand Hall in Silver Ridge was packed with 300 witnesses. Werewolves from every major pack, human law enforcement, media representatives. This would be justice witnessed by the world. Grand Arbiter Lysander, a 70-year-old wolf with silver hair and eyes that had seen centuries of pack politics, presided over the proceedings from an elevated bench. This tribunal is convened under the sovereign accords, Lysander announced, his voice carrying through the hall. We are here to judge the following accused: Alpha Corvus, Blackthorn Magnus, Blackthorn, Counselor Alistair Belmont, and Arthur Sterling. Seraphina sat in the witness section wearing formal attire. Theron sat beside her, his hand resting protectively on the back of her chair. Bastion sat separately under guard, his fate still undecided. The charges, Lysander continued, are severe: human trafficking, bioweapons development, corruption of the Werewolf Council, attempted regicide. How do the accused plead? Not guilty, Corvus snarled. These proceedings are a farce, Belmont declared. Magnus said nothing, his head bowed. Then let us hear the evidence, Lysander said. King Theron, you may present your case. Theron stood. The evidence speaks for itself. Massive screens around the hall lit up. Financial records appeared. Bank transfers from Sterling Security to Corvus Blackthorn, $4.2 million. Transfers to Belmont, $12 million over 3 years. Transfers to 3 other council members, $47 million total. These records were provided by an inside source and verified by 3 independent forensic accountants, Theron stated. The screens shifted. Video footage played. Belmont at a computer terminal entering override codes. The kinetic shielding systems powering down. Timestamp 2 hours before Sterling's attack. Gasps rippled through the hall. Counselor Belmont personally disabled Silver Ridge's defensive systems. Theron continued. 12 men died in the assault that followed, all to recapture one woman who had legally sought asylum. Lysander's expression was carved from granite. Continue. And the prosecution calls Seraphina Blackthorn to testify. Seraphina stood, every eye in the hall fixed on her as she walked to the witness stand. She wore her power like armor now. No submission, no fear. She placed her hand on the ancient text of pack law and swore to tell truth. Miss Blackthorn, Lysander said gently, please tell this tribunal what you experienced in Blackwood Village. Seraphina's voice was steady, clear. For 12 years from age 10 to 22, I was systematically poisoned with wolfsbane. The entire village water supply was contaminated to keep lower-ranking wolves docile, but I was targeted specifically. The dosage I received was lethal, designed not just to suppress my wolf, but to hide my Aurelian bloodline from the Werewolf Council. She looked directly at Corvus. Alpha Corvus knew what I was. My father knew. They kept me weak, kept me invisible, and when I turned 22, they sold me to Arthur Sterling for $4.2 million. Not as a bride, as a bioweapon. My DNA was to be harvested to create super soldier serum for sale to the highest bidder. The hall erupted in outraged voices. Lysander gabbled for silence. Do you have evidence of this sale? Lysander asked. I do. Seraphina produced the original contract, now preserved in evidence sleeves. Transfer of ownership papers. Signed by Alpha Corvus, my father Magnus, and my brother Bastion. Recipient Sterling Security International. Compensation $3.2 million with an additional $1 million upon delivery. She pulled out medical records. These are my blood test results marked Aurelian markers detected. And this is correspondence between Magnus Blackthorn and Arthur Sterling, explicitly discussing acquisition of rare genetic material for bioweapons development. Lysander examined the documents. His jaw tightened. These are authenticated, yes, Arbiter. Does the defense wish to cross-examine? Corvus's attorney stood. Miss Blackthorn, isn't it true you voluntarily left Blackwood Village, that you were never actually delivered to Sterling? I escaped, Seraphina corrected, after discovering I had been sold. I ran for my life through sub-zero temperatures and crossed a frozen river that nearly killed me. That's not voluntary departure. That's survival. The attorney had no response. I have additional testimony, a voice called from the gallery. Bastion Blackthorn stood. Guards moved to stop him, but Lysander raised a hand. Bastion Blackthorn, you were listed as a co-conspirator. Why should this tribunal hear you? Because I can provide testimony against Corvus and Belmont, Bastion said. I'll detail every illegal operation, every smuggling route, every payoff. In exchange, I asked the tribunal to spare my life. Lysander considered. You may testify. Your sentencing will be determined afterward. For the next hour, Bastion detailed the corruption, the silver smuggling operation that had run for 8 years, the bribes to council members, the threats Corvus had used to ensure loyalty. He told me if I didn't sign the transfer papers, he would kill my father and frame my sister for murder. Bastion said, his voice breaking. I was a coward. I chose my own survival over hers. I can't take that back. But I can make sure everyone knows the truth. When Bastion finished, 8 Blackwood civilians came forward. They testified about the poisoned water, the forced labor, the disappearances of wolves who questioned Corvus's rule. The evidence was overwhelming. Lysander called for final statements. Arthur Sterling, represented by attorneys, since he was human and couldn't attend werewolf proceedings, issued a statement denying all knowledge. His lawyers claimed he was a legitimate businessman deceived by Corvus. No one believed it. Belmont tried to claim he was entrapped, that Sterling had blackmailed him. The video evidence destroyed his defense. Corvus remained defiant to the end. She's an Aurelian. She belongs to the pack, not to herself. I had every right. You had no right, Seraphina interrupted, standing. I am not property. I never was. And the fact that you still believe you owned me proves exactly why you need to be removed from power permanently. Lysander gabbled. This tribunal has heard enough. We will deliberate. The deliberation took 20 minutes. When Lysander returned, the hall fell silent. Corvus Blackthorn, guilty on all charges. Sentence life imprisonment without possibility of parole in the deep cells of Silver Ridge. All assets seized. Corvus roared in fury as guards dragged him away. Magnus Blackthorn, guilty of conspiracy and human trafficking, sentenced 25 years imprisonment, all parental rights permanently terminated. Magnus finally looked at Seraphina. She met his gaze with nothing. No anger, no forgiveness, just emptiness where love should have been. Counselor Alistair Belmont, guilty of high treason conspiracy and accessory to attempted murder, sentenced permanent exile from all werewolf territories. If you are found within our lands again, execution is authorized on site. All titles and assets seized. Belmont was led away in chains. Arthur Sterling, guilty in absentia. All evidence will be turned over to the FBI. The Alliance formally requests human authorities pursue charges of bioweapons development, human trafficking, and racketeering. Lysander turned to Bastion. Bastion Blackthorn, your cooperation has been noted. However, you did sign transfer papers selling your sister. Your sentence, 10 years imprisonment with possibility of parole after 5 if you continue to cooperate with ongoing investigations. Bastion nodded, accepting his fate. Finally, Lysander addressed the hall. The Alliance is implementing immediate reforms. The Aurelian Protection Act makes it illegal to suppress or exploit pure bloodlines. The Council Transparency Act requires quarterly financial audits of all council members. The Asylum Rights Act guarantees protection for any werewolf fleeing trafficking or abuse. He looked at Seraphina. Justice is not vengeance, it is restoration. And today we restore what was taken from Seraphina Blackthorn. Her freedom, her identity, her future. The hall erupted in applause. That evening, Seraphina stood outside her father's holding cell. Theron had offered to come, but this was something she needed to do alone. Magnus sat on the narrow cot, his head in his hands. When the door opened, he looked up. For the first time in Seraphina's memory, her father looked old, broken. "Sarah," he whispered. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't call me that. You lost that right." "I never wanted to hurt you," Magnus said. "Corvus threatened to kill the entire family if I didn't cooperate. I thought I was protecting you by keeping you weak. If the council had discovered what you were—" "You could have told the council," Seraphina interrupted. "You could have sought help. Instead, you sold me. You didn't protect me, Father. You protected yourself." Magnus's face crumpled. "I know. God help me, I know." 25 years won't erase what you did," Seraphina said. "It won't give me back my childhood, my wolf, the 12 years you stole from me. But maybe it's enough time for you to understand that I was never yours to sell. I was your daughter, and you threw that away for money." She turned to leave. Seraphina. "Do you hate me?" Seraphina paused at the door. "No, I don't hate you. I don't feel anything for you at all anymore. And that's worse, isn't it?" She walked away, leaving Magnus alone with the weight of his choices. 6 months later, the morning sun rose over Silver Ridge Estate, painting the snow-capped Montana peaks in shades of gold and rose. Seraphina stood on the balcony of her chambers, breathing in the clean mountain air. She was no longer the frightened Omega who had run through frozen forests. She was Seraphina Silvercrest, Queen of the Northern Territories, mate of the Alphaking, and trainer of 6 pure-blooded females who had been rescued from trafficking operations across 3 states. The women were currently in the training yard below, learning to control their shifts under the watchful eye of Beta Declan. "You're smiling," Theron's voice came from behind her. Seraphina turned. Her mate stood in the doorway, wearing casual clothes, his amber eyes warm. "I'm watching them discover what I discovered," Seraphina said. "That being powerful doesn't mean being feared. It means being free." Theron crossed to her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. "You've built something extraordinary here. An academy. A sanctuary." "We built it," Seraphina corrected, leaning back against his chest. "Together." "Speaking of together," Theron murmured, "I have something for you." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Seraphina's breath caught. Theron dropped to one knee. "Seraphina Blackthorn, you were never a pawn. You were never a weapon. You are the most courageous, brilliant, fierce woman I have ever known. You're my mate, my equal, my queen. Will you also be my wife?" He opened the box. Inside was a ring of white gold set with a black diamond that seemed to hold captured starlight. "Yes," Seraphina whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Theron slid the ring onto her finger and stood pulling her into a kiss that tasted of promises in future and home. When they finally broke apart, Seraphina looked out over the estate. In the distance, she could see the boundary pillars where Theron had first found her. "I ran toward freedom that night," Seraphina said softly. "But I found something far more dangerous." "What's that?" Theron asked, his lips against her temple. "Hope," Seraphina said. "I found hope, and a king wise enough to set me free." From the training yard, one of the young wolves howled, a sound of joy, of power reclaimed. Seraphina threw back her head and howled in response, her voice carrying across the mountains. The Aurelian Queen had finally come home.